London, 1884. A morning that looked like every other morning in this city. A grey sky heavy with the promise of rain. Cobblestones still dark and slick from the night before. The air carrying that particular blend of coal smoke and damp stone and the faint sweetness of the flower seller who set up on the corner of Linden Street every Tuesday without fail. But in the courtyard of Hale Manor, something was happening that no morning in this neighborhood had ever seen. A young woman stood in the center of that courtyard in a white silk wedding dress. Her name was Grace. She was 22 years old, and she had not chosen to be here, had not chosen the dress, had not chosen the man she was about to be handed to. Her dark hair had been pinned up beneath a veil, and the October light caught the lace along her sleeves in a way that made her look, from a distance, like something from a painting. Something framed and still and meant to be looked at. Up close, she was shaking. Only slightly. Only in her hands. She had clasped those hands in front of her to keep them still, and every few seconds, measured, deliberate, she would swallow once, as if swallowing was the rope she was holding to keep herself from going under. She was not going to scream. She was not going to fight. She had learned, in the years that built this moment, that fighting in this house only cost you more than whatever you were fighting for. So she stood still. She breathed, and she kept her eyes on the man across the courtyard. Behind her, gripping her arm just above the elbow with the particular grip of someone who expects resistance, stood Samantha Hale, the stepmother. She was 53 years old, dressed in deep burgundy velvet that swept the ground as she moved, heavy gold chains layered at her collar, rings on 3 fingers, her hair wound up high and tight on her head in a style that added another 2 inches to her already considerable presence. Her face was handsome and composed and utterly cold, not from cruelty in this precise moment, but from certainty. Samantha had decided what was going to happen today. People who had fully decided things often wore that expression, the blank, finished look of a conclusion that has already been reached. The servants lined the sides of the courtyard. A handful of neighbors had gathered at the iron gate, or drawn by whatever instinct draws people to the edges of things they sense are significant. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were wind through the elm trees and the faint, controlled rhythm of Grace's breathing. Then Samantha's voice cut through all of it. You should be grateful. A beggar is still a husband. She said it quietly, only for Grace to hear. But in that particular stillness, it carried further than she may have intended. Grace did not answer. She looked at the man across the courtyard, at the dark tailored coat, the grey waistcoat, the silver-handled cane in one hand, the strip of black cloth tied firmly across his eyes. She looked at his outstretched hand. She looked at the way he was waiting, not impatiently, not with the fidgeting discomfort of someone uncomfortable in public, but with a deep, settled stillness that felt, strangely, like the opposite of what the moment should have been. He was the calmest person in that courtyard. She noted that. She swallowed once more, and she walked toward him. Now, before we go any further, before we watch what came next, you need to know how we got here. Because this story did not begin in a courtyard. It did not begin with a dress or a debt or a blindfold. It began years before all of that, in a house that looked perfect from the outside and was quietly falling apart from within. It began with a little girl who lost her mother, a father who lost his nerve, and a stepmother who decided very early on that Grace was a thing to be managed, not a person to be loved. And it ended. Well, it ended somewhere no one in that courtyard was expecting. Stay with me. This one turns. Hey, why, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Thank you so much for being here. It really means the world to me. It is essential that we get your support through subscriptions, likes, and comments. So if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit that subscribe button for us, smash the like, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It helps more than you know. All right, thank you. Now let's get back to the story. Hale Manor sat on the north side of Kensington, set back from the road behind iron gates and a row of old elm trees that shed their leaves every October with the slow, dignified resignation of things that have done this many times before. From the street, it was exactly what a Victorian gentleman's residence should look like. Tall sash windows, stone pillars at the entrance portico, a gravel path swept clean every morning, the family crest above the door still legible despite years of weather. Inside, it was a different country entirely. Sir Thomas Hale was a baron. He had inherited the title at 28, along with the house, the debt that came with the house, and the deeply English conviction that a man of his standing simply did not discuss financial difficulty out loud. Debt was a private matter. It sat in the study in unopened letters and accumulated the way damp accumulates in old walls, quietly, steadily, until the structure is compromised and everyone pretends not to notice. He had made investments over the years, a railway scheme in the north, a shipping venture out of Liverpool, then a land purchase in the country that had been recommended by a friend whose judgment turned out to be considerably worse than his accent had implied. One by one, the investments had failed. The country estate was rented out to pay the most urgent creditors. The paintings in the upstairs hallway had been quietly sold, replaced with very good prints that only someone who had known the originals would recognize as substitutes. The servants had gone from 11 to 4, the carriages from 3 to 1. And Thomas Hale had gone on hosting dinners, wearing his good coat, attending his club, and maintaining the particular fiction of the English gentry, that everything was perfectly fine. Grace had been born in this house in the spring of 1862. Her mother, Elspeth Hale, born Elspeth Drummond, though of a Scottish family with more warmth than money, had filled the rooms with laughter and flowers and the kind of easy, unself-conscious love that makes a home feel genuinely safe. She would read to Grace every evening. She would take her to the park on Sunday mornings, and they would walk slowly, looking at things, and Elspeth would ask questions, not to test Grace, but because she was genuinely interested in how her daughter's mind worked. What do you think about that? What does it remind you of? What would you do if you were the one deciding? Grace had grown up believing that these questions, these real, patient questions, were just what adults did. That all mothers paid attention like this. That love was not something you earned, but something that existed, always. Like the river exists. You didn't have to work for the Thames to be there. Then Elspeth got sick. It was fast and merciless, the way illness was in those years. A cough in October. By December she was confined to the bedroom. By February she was gone, and Grace was 7 years old, standing in a black wool dress in the family pew of St. Margaret's Church in the cold, holding her father's hand and watching the coffin being carried past her. Thomas was devastated. He showed it in the English way, by saying very little about it and carrying on. He hired a governess for Grace. He continued his business activities, such as they were. He had dinner with Grace most evenings and read to her on Sunday afternoons and told himself that he was managing. What he was actually doing was disappearing, though not physically. He was present in the house every day. But grief had moved into him and was taking up space, and the space it occupied was the space that should have been for Grace, and neither of them had the language to say so. 2 years after Elspeth died, Thomas began going to dinner parties again. The invitations had kept arriving, because Thomas had a title, and that remained socially useful, regardless of his bank balance. And at a dinner party in January of 1871, he met Samantha. She was the widow of a man who had been a successful cloth merchant, not aristocratic, not titled, but with sufficient money accumulated in his lifetime that Samantha had been left with resources, a well-furnished house in Chelsea, and the particular social ambition that sometimes comes with being close to a world you haven't quite entered. She had spent 3 years since her first husband's death positioning herself, attending the right gatherings, cultivating the right associations, dressing with the kind of precision that signals seriousness to other serious people. When she met Thomas Hale, she saw something useful. A baron. A real one. An old family name and a London address and an air of established respectability that her own money, however comfortable, could not purchase outright. And he was grieving and slightly adrift, which meant he needed someone to organize him. Samantha was very good at organizing things. Thomas saw a solution. He was not cold about it. He did feel something for Samantha, a genuine admiration for her capability, a gratitude for the way she made the chaos of his life feel manageable. But if he was honest with himself, which in those years he tried not to be, the attraction was substantially practical. Samantha made decisions. She handled things. She filled the space in the house that had been cold and quiet since Elspeth. They were married in August of 1873, 9 months after they met. Grace stood in the church again. Same stone floor, same high windows, same smell of old wood and beeswax. A different ceremony. She was 9 years old, and she had been told by the governess who was trying to be kind, that having a new mother was a good thing, that it would make the house feel like a proper family again. Grace had held that thought carefully, like something fragile, and carried it into the church with her. Samantha's daughter Melissa, 12 years old, a tall girl with Samantha's composure and a tendency to stand in the center of whatever room she occupied, arrived with the marriage. She and Grace were given adjacent bedrooms. They were expected to get along. For 3 months, everyone made an effort. Samantha brought order to the household, menus planned in advance, the remaining servants given clear directives, the weekly schedule regularized. She braided Grace's hair once on a Sunday morning, sitting at the dressing table, and her hands were competent and quick, and Grace wanted very badly to feel something warm in the gesture. Or she tried. Samantha also tried, in those early months, to include Grace in the family's routines. Morning prayers together, evening readings, a walk on Saturday afternoons. But performance is exhausting, and Samantha was not a woman who did things without reason. Once the household was settled, once Thomas was stable, once Melissa was enrolled in the finishing school that had been selected, and the social calendar was arranged, the performance ended. Quietly, without announcement. One morning, Samantha simply stopped including Grace and began instead to give her tasks. The first task was sweeping the upper landing, then preparing the morning room before the family came down, then helping with the laundry on Mondays, then whatever else needed doing on a day when the schedule was particularly full. Thomas noticed. He told himself it was reasonable. The house needed managing, and Grace was old enough to contribute. He told himself this for years, because the alternative was to acknowledge that what was happening in his house was something he should stop. He did not stop it. By the time Grace was 14, her days had taken on a shape that had nothing to do with education or growing or the ordinary business of becoming a person. She woke before sunrise. She helped the remaining cook, a tired woman named Mrs. Brent, who had been with the family since Thomas was a boy, prepare the household's breakfast. She cleaned the entrance hall and the sitting room, and whatever additional room Samantha decided needed attention that particular morning. She ran errands. She carried and fetched and pressed and swept. And when she finished, or she ate whatever was remaining, Melissa, meanwhile, attended Thorndale Ladies' Academy in Belgravia. She had a dressmaker who visited monthly, a French tutor on Thursdays, piano instruction on Tuesdays, and her mother's full and focused attention whenever she wanted it. She moved through the house with the easy confidence of someone who has never once had to wonder whether she was welcome. The two girls shared a house, and almost nothing else. The cruelty Samantha directed at Grace was not dramatic. That was what made it so effective. There were no beatings, no locked rooms, no theatrical villainy. Instead, there was the steady, consistent architecture of smallness. A comment delivered in passing. "Grace, must you always look so plain?" That settled into her mind the way a splinter settles under skin. Small and persistently painful, an accusation leveled with perfect composure. "I'm certain it was Grace who moved my correspondence. She is terribly careless," that Thomas heard and accepted, because Samantha delivered it so reasonably. The accusations were always plausible. A vase cracked, a ribbon missing, a letter that arrived late. Small, unprovable things, delivered in Samantha's measured tone, until the narrative became self-reinforcing. Grace was the source of disruption in this household. Grace was the problem. Grace required managing, and Thomas, tired and ashamed of his failures in too many other areas, accepted the narrative. It was easier than investigating it. Grace had no one to tell. The governess had been let go when money became too tight. Mrs. Brent was kind but powerless, and too old and too tired to risk her position by interfering with the mistress of the house. The acquaintances Grace might have called friends had drifted away as she was gradually kept from social engagements. Too busy, Samantha would explain when invitations arrived. Too much to attend to here. She learned to carry the feelings herself. She learned to do what people learn to do when they exist in a space that constantly questions their worth. She developed a very keen sense of other people. She read moods the way sailors read weather. She knew from the sound of Samantha's footsteps on the stairs whether the morning was going to be calm or difficult. She knew from the set of Thomas's shoulders at the dinner table whether the creditor situation had worsened. She knew, always, exactly where the exits were. That the small room at the top of the house, her mother's reading room, was the only place where none of that vigilance was required. She went there on evenings when the household had gone quiet. She read whatever she could find. Books from the downstairs library that no one else opened, old periodicals, the newspapers Thomas left behind. She read about Parliament and the Empire and the ongoing argument about what women were capable of, which was happening in certain periodicals with a fierceness that even the editors seemed slightly surprised by. She read about power, about who had it, who didn't, and the various mechanisms by which it was kept in certain hands and withheld from others. She read with a hunger that surprised her sometimes. Not the hunger of someone pursuing a subject, but the hunger of someone who is trying to understand the world they are trapped in, as if understanding it precisely enough might eventually show her the door. She had not found the door yet, but she had a very good map. By 1884, Grace was 22. The house was well acquainted with financial difficulty by then. It had been living with it for over a decade. But that autumn, the difficulty became critical. 3 separate creditors had engaged solicitors. 2 had filed formal claims. The bank account was producing statements that Thomas could not look at for more than a moment before folding them and setting them face down. The income from the country estate's tenants was no longer meeting the interest on the accumulated debt, let alone touching the principal. Samantha found out the full severity of it on a Tuesday morning in September, when she opened a letter from one of the solicitors that Thomas had left on his desk for 4 days. It was not addressed to her. She read it anyway. She had always known Thomas was financially struggling. That had been obvious from the early months of the marriage. But she had managed the situation by controlling the household spending and supplementing with her own remaining resources from her first husband's estate. Those resources were also, she now realized, much lower than she had believed. She called Thomas into the study. She closed the door. The servants found reasons to be on other floors. Grace, passing the hallway on her way to the kitchen, heard the sound of Samantha's voice through the closed door. Not words, just sound, a controlled and cutting and cold. She paused for one moment, then kept walking, because some conversations were not hers to enter, and some atmospheres were not hers to absorb. She had enough of her own. Thomas emerged an hour later, looking like a man who had aged overnight. He went to the dining room and sat in his chair, and did not call for anything. He stared at the table. Grace brought him tea anyway. She set it at his elbow, started for the door. "Grace." She stopped, turned. He was still looking at the table. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have been more careful. With everything." It was the most direct thing he had said to her in years. She did not know if he meant the debt, or her childhood, or the years of not intervening when he should have. Perhaps all of it. She looked at him, at the grey that had settled fully into his hair, or at the way his hands were resting on the table like something abandoned, and she felt something complicated. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The particular sadness of seeing someone clearly. "I know, Papa," she said, and she left him to sit with it. Samantha, meanwhile, was not sitting with anything. She was working. That was what distinguished her. In a crisis, she did not collapse or retreat. She assessed. She calculated. She looked at every available variable, and she looked for leverage. And 3 weeks after the letter, a second envelope arrived at Hale Manor, bearing a different seal entirely. A dark red wax impression, stamped with a crown above a pair of crossed keys. The seal of House Clements. Samantha had been half expecting it. She had heard whispers in social circles about the Clements family's matrimonial process, about the way the Duke's father managed such arrangements, the particular methodology they used. She had filed it away as interesting information, the way she filed away most interesting information, carefully, and in a place she could access quickly. She opened the letter before Thomas came down for breakfast. She read it. Then she read it again. Then she set it on the desk, smoothed it flat with her palm, and called Melissa. The letter was precise and formal in the manner of all communications from powerful institutions that do not need to perform their authority. A representative of the Clements estate would visit Hale Manor within the month. The purpose of the visit was matrimonial consideration. Though the Hale family's debt situation, and the letter named the figure, plainly without delicacy, could be resolved through a formal arrangement between the two families. All that was required was an assessment of suitability. The key phrase, buried in the 3rd paragraph, was this: the representative would arrive in advance of any formal offer to observe the household and its members in natural circumstances. Samantha read that phrase 4 times. She had heard the rumor. Once, briefly, at a dinner party 2 years ago, from a woman who had heard it from someone who had direct knowledge of the Clements family's methods. The Duke's father, a King Maxwell Clements, granted his honorary title through a specific treaty 30 years prior, believed that character was best assessed not through formal presentation, but through the way a household treated someone it believed to be of low standing. They reportedly sent a test first, a representative in diminished circumstances, to see what came out when the social polish was removed. Samantha sat with this information for a long time. If the rumor was true, and the letter's careful phrasing suggested it might be, then someone would arrive who wasn't who they appeared to be. The task was to identify that person and manage the household's response accordingly. But then a further thought arrived, colder and more useful. What if you didn't try to fool the test? What if you simply passed Grace through it? The logic was clean in its cruelty. The test candidate, whoever he was, would arrive presenting as humble or dependent or somehow diminished. Samantha would arrange for Grace to marry this candidate, removing Grace from the picture, fulfilling what might be a necessary part of the process, and keeping Melissa available for the real arrangement, the real Duke when he arrived. Grace would be gone. Melissa would be positioned. The debt would be cleared. It was, Samantha told herself, simply practical. Nobody was being harmed. Grace was getting a husband, which was more than she might have managed otherwise. Samantha had never wanted her in this house. Now there was a mechanism to relocate her. It was the most efficient thing she had done in years. She told Thomas about the letter that evening with measured calm, a potential arrangement with the Clements family. The debt settled, Melissa as the primary candidate for the formal offer when it came. Thomas asked about Grace. Samantha's answer took 3 sentences and left no room for follow-up questions. Thomas ate his dinner in silence and did not pursue it, because pursuing things was not what Thomas did, and both of them knew it. Grace was in her mother's reading room that evening, watching the street below, when the first sense of something coming reached her, not as knowledge, but as a change in the air of the house. A new kind of purposefulness in Samantha's movements over the following days, a new kind of appraisal in the way Samantha sometimes glanced at her. She told herself she was imagining it. She was not imagining it. He arrived on the 14th of October, 3 weeks after the letter. Not in a grand equipage. Not with a footman or a visiting card on a silver tray. A plain black coach, unremarkable. He stopped outside the gates on a grey Tuesday morning, and a single man descended from it. Grace saw him first, from the upstairs window of the morning room where she was cleaning the glass. She noticed the height. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a way of holding himself that suggested someone who had never spent much time being anxious. He wore a dark coat, tailored well but not ostentatiously, a grey waistcoat visible at the lapels, a black cravat. He carried a silver-handled cane in one hand, and across his eyes, tied at the back of his head, was a strip of black cloth. She held her cloth against the glass and watched him move up the path. He navigated it without hesitation, which struck her as notable, though she didn't yet know what to make of it. Downstairs, where Samantha had already positioned herself in the entrance hall, she took in the plain coach, the single driver, the absent footman, the blindfold. She processed all of this in approximately 4 seconds. Then she received him, very graciously, and asked him to wait in the sitting room while she made arrangements. He introduced himself as he entered. "Richards, I'm here regarding the House Clements correspondence. I hope I find the family well." He offered nothing more. No explanation for the blindfold. No apology for the plain coach. He simply sat in the offered chair, rested his cane against the arm of it, and waited with a stillness that filled the room more effectively than movement would have. Samantha excused herself. She went upstairs. She walked directly to Grace's door and knocked. "Come down," she said, when Grace opened it. Or wear the grey dress with the white collar, and do something about your hair." "Who's come?" Grace asked. "Someone who needs a wife," Samantha said, "and you are going to fill that position." Grace looked at her stepmother and understood, in the particular way she had learned to understand things in this house, not through explanation, but through the architecture of what was left unsaid, that this was not a request. She nodded. She went to change. Melissa, informed of the situation by her mother that afternoon, received the news with the particular satisfaction of someone who has confirmed exactly what they expected. She looked at Grace in her grey dress, smiled with her mouth only, and went back to her piano practice. But then Samantha made a decision she would spend years regretting. She chose the white silk dress instead. "What, you should look the part," she said, directing the housemaid to help Grace change. "If you are going to be married, you will be dressed for it." Not because she wanted Grace to look well, because she wanted the scene to be unambiguous. She wanted the people who watched, the servants, the neighbors who would inevitably notice, the social circles that consumed this kind of information, to see a real exchange. A girl in a wedding dress, given to a man in a blindfold. A clear, visual story of what the Hale family was willing to do with their surplus daughter. She did not anticipate that the man in the blindfold was also watching. He was watching everything. The housemaid's name was Agnes. She was 16 years old, and she had been at Hale Manor for 2 years, and she had never once in those 2 years seen Miss Grace cry, or even when there were clearly reasons to. But as Agnes fastened the white silk buttons at the back of the dress, button after button, in the quiet of the small dressing room, she felt Grace's shoulders rise once, sharp and controlled, and then settle again. Agnes kept her eyes on the buttons and said nothing, because she was 16 and she did not have words for what she was witnessing. But when she had finished and stepped back, she pressed Grace's hand briefly with both of hers. 1 second. Then she stepped away. Grace looked at herself in the mirror. She looked at the dress, beautiful, borrowed, belonging to a story that was not hers, and she made a decision. She could not choose what was happening. She could choose how she moved through it. She lifted her chin. She straightened her shoulders. She walked to the door. Then Melissa appeared in the hallway. "Well," Melissa said, looking at the dress, "I suppose it suits you well enough for the occasion." Grace passed her without answering and went down the stairs. In the formal sitting room, Richards had been given a cup of tea and a copy of the Times. The tea sat untouched on the side table. The newspaper was folded in his lap. He appeared, to anyone who looked, to be simply resting. To anyone paying closer attention, and Grace, who had spent years paying close attention to things others missed, was paying it now. He appeared to be listening to every sound the house made, to every footstep, every creak, every inflection of voice from the rooms around him. Samantha made the introduction with practiced smoothness. "This is my stepdaughter Grace. She is 22, of sound character and good health, and well suited to your circumstances. We are prepared to proceed with the arrangement at your earliest convenience." Your circumstances. The phrase was deliberate and unkind, and both Samantha and the man across the room knew exactly what it meant. "Miss Grace," he said. His voice was deeper than she had expected. Steady. "Sir," she said, "would you tell me a little about yourself?" Samantha made a small movement, almost impatience, almost dismissal. But he had addressed the question to Grace, and Grace answered it. She said she enjoyed reading, that she had managed the practical running of the household for several years, that she was accustomed to quiet work and modest circumstances, that she had always been interested in how the world was ordered, though she had not had much opportunity to engage with it directly. Or she said it all very calmly, without performing modesty or performing confidence, just saying the true things in a straightforward way, because it was the only mode she had left after years of having the other modes made unavailable to her. Richards listened with complete attention. When she finished, he said, "Thank you. That's more than most people offer." Samantha moved things forward swiftly after that. Papers, a brief formality, and then the courtyard, the white dress, the elm trees, the watching servants, the neighbors at the gate. Samantha's hand on Grace's arm, steering her forward. The man standing at the far side, with his cane and his blindfold and his outstretched hand. "You should be grateful," Samantha said quietly into Grace's ear. "A beggar is still a husband." Grace looked at the hand being extended to her. She thought, and for a brief and slightly irrational moment, about what her mother would say if she were here. Elspeth, who had taught her that people's worth was in how they treated each other, not in what they wore or what they held. Elspeth, who had always paid attention. She placed her hand in his. His grip was careful and warm and immediately, quietly, safe. Not romantic. She did not let herself think that word yet. But safe in the way that solid ground is safe after you have been standing on something uncertain. She breathed, and then she walked back into the house, and the arrangement was sealed, and the world she had always known continued on its surface as if nothing had changed. Underground, everything had shifted. Samantha had arranged for Richards to stay in the East Guest Wing for several days while the paperwork was drawn up. She told Thomas this was standard practice for formal arrangements of this kind. In truth, she wanted to keep him visible and managed until she could confirm that the real Clement's arrangement, the real Duke, the real offer, the prize for Melissa, was forthcoming. She needed to know what this man was before she committed to anything irreversible. What she did not account for was how Grace would handle it. On the first morning, Grace appeared at the guest wing door with a breakfast tray before anyone had thought to send one. She knocked and announced herself. She set the tray on the table by the window and described the contents: soft-boiled eggs, toast, a pot of Darjeeling, cream in a small pitcher, a dish of marmalade, clearly and without fanfare, the way you would for someone who found that information useful. Then she moved the chair slightly, pulling it an inch or two closer to the table so it was easier to find, and she moved to the window. "The window faces east," she said. "There's sun this morning if you'd like it open." A pause. "Please," he said. She opened the window. October came in, cool and thin, carrying the last warmth of the season underneath its chill. She was at the door when he spoke. "Why did you do that?" "Which part?" "All of it. The description. The chair." She considered this. "Because it seemed useful, and because you're a guest in this house. Guests should be comfortable." A beat of silence. "Your stepmother does not appear to share that philosophy." "No," Grace said, and she left that there, exactly there, and went back downstairs. She did not know why she had done any of it. No, that was not true, or she knew exactly why. She had done it because it was the right thing to do, and because the right thing to do had never, in this house, been rewarded or even noticed. But she had never been able to stop doing it anyway. It was the one thing Samantha hadn't managed to take from her in all these years. The habit of basic decency. She came back the following morning, and the morning after that. And in the evenings, after the household had settled, after Samantha had retired and Melissa had gone upstairs and Thomas had closed himself in his study, Grace would sometimes sit with Richards for an hour in the small parlour off the east wing. They talked about books, about the city, about the arguments happening in Parliament that year, regarding women's property rights, which Grace had opinions on that surprised her with their firmness when she spoke them aloud. He listened to her the way almost no one had ever listened to her, not waiting for her to finish so he could respond, but actually absorbing what she said, turning it over, asking follow-up questions that showed he had heard the specific thing she had expressed and not just the general shape of it. On the third evening, he asked her, "If you could change one thing about how this world is ordered, what would it be?" Grace set down her teacup. She thought about it properly, which was something she rarely got to do in conversation. Usually she had to answer quickly, deflect, keep the exchange moving at whatever pace others set. But he waited. He simply waited. "I would make it harder for people to decide someone else's worth for them," she said, finally. "But we do it constantly. We look at a person's circumstances, and we decide what they deserve, what they're capable of, who they are. And we're almost always making those judgments based on what's useful to us, not on anything true about the other person. I think that is the root of most cruelty. It's not hatred. It's the laziness of deciding someone's story before you've heard it." The fire settled in the grate. Richards was very still. "That's the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in a very long time," he said quietly. Grace looked at him, at the blindfold, at the still face beneath it, at the quality of attention he gave her that she had never encountered before in any room of this house, and she felt something shift in her chest, something she had kept sealed for years, and behind all the practicality and restraint that survival had required of her. She didn't name it. It was too new and too unfamiliar, and she had learned not to trust new things quickly. But she noted it, filed it in the private ledger she kept for things that needed time before they could be understood. She said good night. She went upstairs to her mother's reading room and pressed her back to the door and breathed in the familiar cold and dust of it, and she thought, something is different. Meanwhile, Richards was doing what he had come here to do. He was watching. He was listening to every sound the house made around him. He was building a precise and detailed picture of every person in it, how they spoke when they thought no one important was present, how they moved when comfort was on the line, who they were in the spaces between performances. He had been doing this for years, in various households, in various situations. He had developed a particular methodology. Remove every external marker of power, and what remains tells you everything. People are almost never as they appear when they believe they're being assessed by someone who matters. But they are almost always exactly themselves when they believe they aren't. He had heard Samantha refer to him, to Melissa, in a tone she thought was private, as the arrangement for Grace. He had heard Melissa laugh. He had heard Thomas say nothing. He had heard Grace, every morning, knock on his door before she opened it. Describe what was on the tray. Pull out the chair. Open the window. He had heard Grace, in conversation, to speak with the careful precision of someone who has thought deeply about things and been given very little opportunity to share the thoughts. He had heard her be fair about her father in a way that could only come from someone who had genuinely examined her own feelings and decided on honesty over performance. By the fifth evening, Richards had seen everything he needed to see. He wrote a letter that night. Long, private, to his father. It said, among other things, "I have found her." Samantha arranged the acknowledgement ceremony for the 7th day. She framed it as a formality, a small gathering of close social acquaintances to witness the preliminary agreement between the Hale family and the representative from House Clements before the formal paperwork was filed. In practice, it was a performance, and Samantha was an experienced director. She had selected the guest list with precision, 6 people whose opinions carried weight in the relevant social circles, whose presence would establish the story before it could be told any other way. The sitting room was arranged. Fresh flowers were ordered. The best remaining china was brought out. She dressed Melissa in the deep blue silk that had been made for the previous season and never worn, deliberately saved for an occasion that required impact. She positioned Melissa near the fireplace, where the light was best, where she would be seen immediately when anyone entered. Thomas stood near the window. He had aged another 5 years in the past week, somehow. Yet he looked like a man who had long ago lost the energy to shape events and was simply waiting to see how they settled. Grace came downstairs in the white silk again. She had not been offered another option, and she walked into the room with her back straight and her hands calm, and the particular composure that is not peace, but its surface. She had been here before, in different versions. She knew how to do this. The guests arrived. There were greetings, the exchange of pleasantries, the small ballet of social England in full performance. And then Richards entered. He came through the door with his cane and his blindfold and his composed, unhurried walk, and the room shifted in that small, social way that rooms shift when something unexpected enters them. A guest murmured something to another, or one of the older women straightened slightly in her chair. Samantha moved smoothly to redirect attention with a remark about the weather turning. The way she always redirected things she wanted not examined too closely. She was in the middle of a sentence when Richard stopped. He stood in the center of the sitting room. He set his cane carefully against the back of the nearest chair. He brought both hands up, and then, in one smooth motion, he untied the blindfold and let it fall. The room went absolutely still. His eyes were dark and completely clear, and they moved across the room with the kind of focus that belongs to someone who has always been able to see everything and has simply been choosing, for a time, what to reveal. Samantha's expression underwent 3 changes in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, and then a whitening of the face that she couldn't control, that moved through her composure like a crack through porcelain. "Allow me to introduce myself properly," Richard said. His voice had changed, not in volume. He did not raise it, but something had entered it, the way weather enters a landscape, inevitably, without asking permission. "My name is Richard Clements. I am the Duke of Clements. My father is His Majesty King Maxwell Clements. I have been a guest in this house for the past 7 days. I have been here under a deliberate arrangement, not a deception, but an assessment, because the most reliable way to understand who people truly are is to observe how they behave toward someone they believe to be powerless." He paused. "Let it settle." One of the guests had a hand pressed to her mouth, while another had set down his teacup very slowly and was looking at the floor. The room felt like a held breath. "In 7 days," Richards continued, "I have observed this household carefully. I have observed that certain members of it decided, within minutes of my arrival, that I was useful to their existing plans in a specific way, not as a person to be treated with consideration, but as a mechanism for resolving an inconvenience." Samantha began to speak. "Your Grace, I assure you that the family's intentions, I know what the intentions were. Not harsh, irrefutable. I heard them, quite clearly. In this house's particular interest in ensuring that the inconvenient daughter was managed before the main arrangement could proceed. I heard the word beggar more than once. I heard decisions being made about another person's life without once consulting her preference. Melissa had gone the color of unglazed clay. Thomas was looking at the floor with the expression of a man who is meeting himself honestly for the first time in years. "What I also observed," Richard said, "and what I want to name clearly in this room, with these witnesses, is that one person in this household conducted herself with complete and consistent decency throughout. Not when she knew she was being assessed, not when she had anything to gain from it. Every morning, every conversation, every small moment where she had every reason to be unkind and chose otherwise." He turned. His gaze found Grace, standing near the door, very still. Something in her face was trying to stay composed and not entirely succeeding, not from weakness, but from the sheer unfamiliarity of being seen this clearly by anyone out loud. He crossed the room. His steps were certain and unhurried, the steps of a man who has never had to pretend he didn't know where he was going. He stopped in front of her. "Miss Grace, I would like, with your preference, and only yours, to make this arrangement formal. Properly formal. Not as convenience, not as settlement, as a choice." The room was watching, all of it. Every person in it with their full attention on the two people standing near the door. Grace was quiet for a moment, long enough that it was clearly a real consideration, not a performance. Then she said, in a voice that was entirely her own, clear and steady and warm, with something that had no name yet but would have one, eventually. Yes. It was not dramatic. It was not the breathless response of a girl swept away. It was the yes of a woman who had waited 22 years to choose something for herself, and who was choosing it now with her eyes fully open. The room released its breath, and in the silence that followed, Samantha Hale stood and looked at what she had built, her careful plan, her calculated management, her years of positioning, and she watched it become, in the space of 10 minutes, the instrument of her own complete exposure. The days that followed were not tidy. Nothing that comes after a long cruelty ever is. Samantha tried, in the immediate aftermath, to manage the narrative. She told people privately that Richards had been misled by Grace's careful performance, that Grace had known all along who he was and had positioned herself accordingly. It was a clever version of events. It had a certain plausibility, and it might have worked in another era or with another man. Richards moved against it efficiently. He provided to his solicitor and to 3 of the witnesses present that afternoon a written account of the specific things he had observed in his 7 days at Hale Manor. He provided dates and times and precise descriptions of specific conversations. He named what he had heard and when he had heard it. He did not editorialize, he simply documented. Documentation, it turned out, or was considerably more powerful than social counter-narrative. Thomas called Grace to his study the evening after the ceremony. She sat across the desk from him, the desk with its history of unopened letters and avoided conversations, and waited while he assembled whatever it was he needed to say. "I have not been the father you deserved," he said finally. His voice was hollow with the specific echo of a man who has arrived, very late, at a truth he should have reached decades ago. "I told myself I was maintaining the household, keeping things stable. I told myself your stepmother was managing things appropriately. I knew she wasn't. I simply did not want the cost of saying so." Grace looked at her father, at the grey of his hair and the deep lines in his face, and the way he was holding his hands in his lap, not clasped, not controlled, just resting there, like things that had stopped trying. "The worst of it isn't what you didn't do," she said quietly. "It's that I kept hoping, for years, that you would see it. That one morning you would walk in and say, 'This isn't right. and I'm going to stop it. I kept waiting for that morning." Thomas said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. "I don't need an apology that undoes any of it," Grace said. "I'm not sure that exists. But I need you to understand, for yourself, not for me, that your silence was not neutrality. It was a choice, and it cost me more than you know." Thomas nodded. Slowly, heavily. He looked like a man carrying exactly the weight he deserved to carry, and finding it, as one always does, heavier than expected. "I know," he said. "I know. King Maxwell Clements arrived in London 3 days after the ceremony. He was a man of 60, upright and silver-haired, with the kind of composed authority that belongs to people who have been in rooms where real decisions are made for long enough that posturing has become entirely unnecessary. He requested a private meeting with Grace on the afternoon of his second day in the city. She received him in the drawing room. They sat across from each other. He studied her with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who had not reached his position by being imprecise in his assessments of people. "My son communicated to me by letter," he said after a moment. "Before he removed the blindfold, he wrote to me about you specifically." Grace waited. "He said that you were the only person in that household who made him feel like a person. Not a duke, not an arrangement. A person." King Maxwell paused. For a man in his position, with the weight of his responsibilities, and the number of people who interact with him in terms of what he can offer them, that quality of being seen as a person is rarer than almost any other thing. The fact that you provided it, without knowing who he was, without any reason other than basic human decency, that is sufficient. More than sufficient." He extended his hand. Grace shook it. "Welcome to the family," he said. And that was all he said. It was enough. That afternoon, Grace went to find Richards in the garden. He was standing at the edge of the elm trees, his coat on against the October cold, looking up at the London sky, which was doing what it usually did in October, which was being grey and layered and quietly magnificent in a way that required patience to appreciate. Grace stood beside him and looked up too. After a moment, she said, "You could have told me, before any of it." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Because I needed to know who you were before you knew who I was. It matters enormously to me, personally, not just as a methodology. I have met many people who are kind to a duke. I have met very few people who are kind to a man in a blindfold, in a borrowed coach, who gives them no reason at all." Grace turned that over. Then, "And what did you decide? About who I was?" He turned to look at her. Fully, or the way he listened, the same quality of complete, unhurried attention, extended now into a look that she felt all the way through. "I decided that you are the most genuinely honest person I have encountered in years, that you have been told, in 100 different ways, that your quietness is weakness, and that you almost came to believe it, and that you were wrong not to." She held his gaze. "You noticed a great deal. You were not difficult to notice. You were the only person in that house who wasn't performing." She almost smiled. "I was performing. I was performing composure every day." "That's not performance," he said. "That's discipline. There's a difference." She thought about that for a moment. Then she reached out, the same gesture he had made in the courtyard, the same hand. And she took his. He held it the way he had held it before, carefully and with both warmth and steadiness, as if he understood that she needed both and was prepared to offer them without condition. They stood like that for a while, in the October garden, under the grey London sky. Grace thought, I chose this. I am standing here because I chose it, not because I was pushed. And that fact, that small, enormous fact, felt like the first real thing that had happened to her in years. Samantha and Melissa left Hale Manor before the formal engagement announcement was made. The departure was not dramatic. There was no scene, no confrontation. Samantha was too intelligent for public scenes. She understood the landscape completely, understood she had lost it. And she packed her things and moved them to the house in Chelsea with the efficiency of someone who has accepted a conclusion and is already planning the next chapter. Whether that next chapter involved genuine reflection or simply a new strategy is not something this story can answer with certainty. People with Samantha's particular makeup do not often change direction easily, but circumstance has a way of insisting, eventually, on being reckoned with. Melissa was 25 years old and had built her entire sense of identity on the scaffolding of her mother's scheming and her own social position. Without either, she found herself in unfamiliar territory. She was not bad at her core. She was simply someone who had never been required to be good, which is its own kind of damage. Whether she grew into something better is the kind of story that doesn't end neatly, because real growth never does. Thomas retained his title. The Clements estate absorbed the outstanding debts, not as a transaction, not tied to Grace as a cost, but because Richards had decided, with the particular clarity of someone who has studied how systems of obligation create suffering, that punishing the Baron further would principally harm the servants and tenants of Hale Manor, who had no part in creating the problem. It was generous in the way that genuine generosity always is, without performance and without requiring anything in return, except that Thomas face what he had done and choose differently going forward. Thomas chose differently, slowly, imperfectly, as with the particular difficulty of someone changing a habit of avoidance that has calcified over decades. But he chose it. That counted for something. The engagement was announced in December of 1884. The wedding was planned for May of the following year. In the months between, Grace and Richards met often. They walked, they talked. They wrote letters when they were apart, long ones, real ones, the kind of correspondence that builds something between two people that withstands time and difficulty, and the ordinary grinding friction of two different people trying to understand each other. They disagreed sometimes. They were honest about it. They found that disagreement, when it happens between people who are genuinely trying to hear each other, is not a threat, but a process. Grace moved slowly. She had learned, through long experience, not to be careful with new things. But Richards was patient in a way that was not passivity, but genuine steadiness, the patience of someone who has decided that what they are waiting for is worth waiting for, and who does not fidget in the meantime. She came to trust that patience, and eventually, not in a single moment but across many of them, she came to love him. Not the dramatic love of someone rescued, not the gratitude of someone elevated. The quiet, daily, chosen love of someone who has decided that this particular person is worth knowing better, endlessly, for as long as there is time. On a morning in January, a few months before the wedding, Grace sat in her mother's reading room for what she knew would be one of the last times. She had a cup of tea. She looked at the shelves, the familiar spines, at the books that had been her companions in the years when she had very few others. The window faced east. The winter light came in thin and pale and entirely beautiful. She thought about Elspeth, about what her mother would say if she could see this morning. She thought about the courtyard and the white dress, and the hand she had reached for in a moment of helplessness, and found to be something she had not expected. She thought about Richard's in the garden, saying, "You were the only person in that house who wasn't performing." And Grace smiled. The real one. The wide, private, unguarded smile that her mother would have recognized immediately. The smile that had been locked away for so long she had almost forgotten she owned it. She sat with it for a while. The light, the tea, the quiet room that had held her through the worst of it. Then she stood up. She smoothed her dress. She carried her teacup downstairs. She had things to do today. Good things this time. Things she had chosen. That was new. And it was enough. Before we close this story, I want to ask you something real. If you were Grace, would you forgive a father who watched you suffer for years just to keep the house standing? Don't give me a quick yes or no. Drop your answer in the comments and tell me why. Because that question doesn't have an easy answer, and the people who know that are exactly who this story was written for. And if you want more Victorian stories where justice is real, where love is earned and not performed, and where the quiet ones finally get their moment, subscribe and turn on notifications. The next one is even colder. And the twist? Nobody sees it coming. What some people think power is for punishment. That once the world finally turns in your favor, you use it to collect what you were owed. To make the people who underestimated you feel exactly what that felt like. To even every score, settle every account, answer every wound with a wound of matching size. Richard's Clements did not do that. He did something harder. He named what had happened, plainly, where it could be heard and not revised. And then he turned toward what came next, because that is the nature of genuine strength. It does not need to destroy what it has already surpassed. It has enough. It can afford to be clear instead of cruel, and to choose the future over the score. Grace did not win this story because luck happened to her. She was not rescued. She did not suddenly become visible to a powerful man at the right moment. She was seen because she was already worth seeing, because she had been building herself, quietly, in a cold room with old books and a window facing east, for years before anyone came looking. She had done the work of becoming someone, while no one was crediting her for it. And Richards found her not because of the dress, or the courtyard, or the arrangement. He found her because she treated him like a person when there was nothing in it for her. That is the lesson underneath all of this, if you are looking for one. The way you treat people when there is nothing to gain from it, that is the truest thing about you. It is the thing that cannot be faked for long, the thing that survives every disguise and every circumstance. Guard it carefully, because sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the person you are treating with dignity in a moment, no one appears to be watching, is paying far closer attention than you know. Thank you for sitting with this story. I'll see you in the next one.